Thank you very much for that very wholesome introduction. And I should thank the IPA for today and for the invitation, and to acknowledge that over the last 20, 30 years, the IPA has been very much involved in broadly a number of areas, but education in particular. Some of you I'll recognise in the audience might remember, I think it was called ACES, when Leone Kramer and others many years ago started a unit, I think, within the IPA that looked specifically at education, and the arguments we've had back then, we're still having today. So thank you to the organisers and for the invitation. I'd also like to thank Andrew Bolt. I'm not sure whether he's still here, but I do write for the media, the print media, and in many ways Andrew is the reason for that. Many years ago, he was an editor at the Herald Sun, and I started writing about 20 years, 30 years ago, about many of the issues that we still face as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you for coming along. I don't have a lot of time, so what I'll do is give you a bit of an overview of what I consider to be many of the recent, when I say recent, the last 30, 40 years in education, a lot of the movements or theories that have had an adverse impact on what I consider to be education, and I'll talk about my definition, which I've borrowed obviously from others later on. But if you look at what's been happening in school education, mainly, also universities, but school education, we've moved a long way from what I remember as a kid. I was talking to somebody outside before, and I grew up in Broadmeadows, Housing Commission. Dad was actually a communist, and that was an interesting family because Mum was a good Catholic. So it was Mass on Sunday and the Eureka Youth Movement on Tuesday. I was about 12, 14, and I remember it well, all the glossy magazines from Mao and Stalin. But it was a great house to grow up in because we always argued politics and religion. But I remember as a kid, we used to start school with Monday Assembly, and I might get it wrong, but I love God and my country. Does anybody remember? Honestly, I've faithfully served my parents, teachers and the laws. And we were in school, a photo of the Queen above the office. I've been doing a lot of work around Australia in education the last few months related to the National Curriculum Review, which I'm not going to talk about. It's a bit like Faulty Towers. Don't talk about the war. Don't talk about the national curriculum. I made the mistake of talking about it when I was appointed, and I made what I thought was not a very dramatic statement that young people after 12 years of schooling should know something about religions and belief systems of the world, whether it's obviously Christianity, but also Islam, Buddhism, Judaism. And is there a verb for tweeted? I was sort of destroyed in the Twitter sphere for about a week for mentioning religion. So I have to be careful. But to get back to education, one of the interesting things that I've found over the years is that education, as I knew it growing up, has changed dramatically. One thing now is that we have to teach competencies and generic skills. And some of you might remember the Carmichael report, the Mayer report. There was a big push from business, collecting, analysing information, communicating ideas and information, planning and organising activities, working with others, using mathematical ideas, solving problems, using technology. This has been a significant push in education, and it's been going on for 20, 30 years at least. The issue I have is that a lot of the research shows that in fact these so-called generic skills or competencies don't exist in a vacuum. They don't just pull them out of the air. They're often domain specific. So they have to be taught within the context of what Jerome Bruner called the structure of the discipline. And I was an English teacher, I love poetry. An example would be that if in a class we were talking about, say, a Wordsworth or a Yeats poem, we have to know something about alliteration, about assonance, about the musical quality of language. We need to know something about metaphor, about imagery. That is very different to reading an IKEA manual where you're simply putting together a cabinet or a desk. Now, one's aesthetic, one's moral, the other is utilitarian, practical. And when you look at the different subjects, whether it's mathematics or music or dance, if you consider that a subject, Hurst and Peters would, sorry, I'm going to say Hurst and Peters wouldn't, I don't think, but I could be corrected. But the generic skills generally only arise within the structure of a discipline, and that has to be the primary purpose. What also happened was we had to prepare students for the 21st century. And again, if I had $1 for every time I've heard the expression 21st century learning, or lifelong learning, or multi-skilled, multi-adaptable learning, I never quite work out what it means, but there was an interesting secondary school Australian principals organisation that defined it. So we have to teach 21st century learning, lifelong, learner-driven, just-in-time, customised, transformative, collaborative, contextual, and most important, learning how to learn. So the question then becomes, well, what's actually going on in the classroom? The third influence, and this is one which a number of speakers have touched on today, and if you, I'll give it a plug, dumbing down the e-version, where I deal with this in a great deal of depth. The cultural left, as I called them, took the long march some years ago, and some people talk about Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who used that expression. Other people talk about the Paris riots in the late 60s and the fact that the left decided that they would never win at the barricades, so what they would have to do would be to take the long march. Now, whether it's church, family, education, universities, the idea is to overthrow the status quo and to radically change society. And in the past, and even still, I'm often attacked as being a conservative, and it's interesting, some of the discussion this morning, after the National Curriculum Review was announced, I was attacked by academics for being misogynist, Eurocentric, homophobic. The worst of all, actually, was being attacked for being Christian, which apparently is the greatest sin of all. But anyway, when I told them that I'd been in the Eureka Youth Movement, they kind of changed their mind. But the left, the cultural left, has started this long march. And it's had a profound effect, not just on universities, but also the school curriculum, which has nothing to do with the review of the national curriculum. But the argument is that the established forms of knowledge are simply a social, cultural construct employed to marginalise and disempower the less powerful. So if you read, I think Foucault was mentioned, if you read Bourdieu, if you go back to Gramsci, the Italian, the argument is that there are no disciplines that have any inherent value in terms of objectivity or truth. Really what you have are socio-cultural constructs that are used by those more powerful to oppress so-called victim groups. And you might remember Mother Russia, or Joan Kerner, as I call her, from Victoria, who was Education Minister and then became Premier. But Joan actually had the conviction of her beliefs and gave a very good talk at a Fabian Society many years ago, where she talked about getting rid of our higher school certificate. And we've had this debate in England and Australia about senior school certificates and whether they're elitist, competitive, whether they favour particular socio-economic groups. If you've read the Gonski report, a lot of that is based on the premise that socio-economic status is the main cause of educational disadvantage, which is a whole other argument I won't get into. But what the left argued is that competition, examinations reinforce inequality and disadvantage. There was a good book, I think All Will Have Prizes. Was it Melanie Phillips? I think wrote a book in England, All Shall Have Prizes, which talks about this movement in education where we got rid of 1 to 10 when 4 meant fail, or A to E where E meant fail. So you had continuous diagnostic formative assessment, whatever that is, instead of summative assessment. So the argument is everyone's a winner. I taught English. The funny thing in Australia is we love sport. We love to win against the Pommies in cricket. We love to win in rugby union against the New Zealanders. But when it comes to education, we have this strange cultural idea that we have to celebrate everyone because we don't want to hurt their self-esteem. It'll somehow cause them to doubt themselves. Of course, when they go into university, not being able to write a properly structured essay, or they become an apprenticeship carpenter and can't measure anything because they can't do any mental arithmetic, that's when they really get into trouble. But we kind of disguise that. In English, we have social critical literacy. So there was a debate in New South Wales some years ago about the impact of theory on Year 12 literature, where something like Othello has to be deconstructed in terms of gender or race. My favourite examples include even in primary school, where something like Cinderella can't be read or in the library because it privileges a particular view of males and females. And certainly, if you look at even Thomas the Tank Engine, where you've got the controller, you've got categories of trains, you've got the buses that aren't as high in terms of the structure, it's obviously reinforcing capitalist hierarchies. So you can't do Thomas the Tank Engine. We all know that. And theories also had a significant influence on objectivity and truth, because apparently how each individual relates to and understands the world is subjective. And I have been at lectures where people say to me, you can't teach a David Malouf novel or a Henry Lawson poem. Not only is the author dead, there is no author, but words don't have any referential meaning anyway. And in fact, if it's somebody's belief that they have responded in a subjective way, then you have to value their opinion. And you wonder why when I talk to people, even in the law, who employ graduates, they find it very hard to tell the graduates that actually you're wrong. You've not understood the brief. Because not only often can't they précis or know anything about grammar, not that I'm a hero on grammar, but they believe that they have the right to somehow give their opinion. So language is a play of signifiers, everything's a text to be deconstructed. We have exams around Australia now where movie posters could be a good thing, but when they start saying graffiti or SMS messages should be given time in the classroom, then I have to worry. Terry Eagleton, even though he's changed his mind recently, some years ago wrote a book on theory where he argued that Shakespeare, his works, had no inherent meaning, and that there could be a time when Shakespeare was off the curriculum because, again, he's only a dead white male, European male, and his work is a social cultural construct with no inherent value. So everything's a text. All cultures are of equal worth. And it's interesting, they don't talk about multiculturalism anymore. They talk about diversity and difference. So the new sort of catch cry is diversity and difference. All cultures are equal. And there's nothing unique or significant about Western civilization, which beggars a question, as Andrew Bolt said, why are so many people so desperate to come and live in Australia? And I just came back from Cambodia. I travel a bit in Indochina. If you go to Burma or Myanmar or even Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they're totalitarian regimes where people can be picked off the street. There's no freedom of press. If you want to invest money, you find that you're suddenly talking to people who want your money without any guarantee that you'll get any results. We actually are incredibly lucky to live in a Western liberal democracy. But according to a lot of the people who have been writing the books on education, we shouldn't privilege Western civilization. And that's has had a profound impact. And Christianity is simply one belief system among many. And again, you know, in dumbing down, I give examples of that, where religion, if it is mentioned, is simply Christianity along with Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, etc., etc. So there's no recognition that we are a Christian nation. So the alternative, Matthew Arnold, Culture and Anarchy, the best that's been thought and said is an expression many of you would know. And I've argued for many years that we really should get back to a sense of education dealing with that. And Michael Oakeshott, who I only started to read a couple of years ago, has a lovely essay, Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind. And in that, he talks about education as a conversation beginning thousands of years ago, involving a myriad of voices and evolving over time. And if you think about Western civilization, whether we go back through Europe or England or ancient Greece or Rome, many of, even the Scandinavian countries, even the impact of, say, Spain, some of the obviously European countries, it's involved a range of voices. So it's actually wrong just to say it's dead white European males. I mean, in fact, our Western civilization is very rich and multifaceted. But what Oakeshott talks about is, and I'll quote him, education, properly speaking, is an initiation into the skill and partnership of this conversation, in which we learn to recognise the voices, to distinguish the proper occasions for utterance, and in which we acquire the intellectual and moral habits appropriate to the conversation. Now, each of the disciplines has its own unique flavour to that, but I think as a fundamental point, it's important. And I'll just finish off with what I think that means in terms of education, school education. When you look at a curriculum, it should draw on the established bodies of knowledge, understanding and skills to get back to the structure of the disciplines. Now, that doesn't mean that other areas, co-curricular, music, sport, drama, aren't important. They are important. But if we're talking about the formal curriculum, then the established bodies of knowledge, we need to stress and respect the past as well as the importance of the future. And T.S. Eliot wrote a very small book on education that's very useful here, because he talks about that accumulated wisdom over hundreds, if not thousands of years, that we simply can't ignore. Education should be committed to rationality and truth, unlike theory, where there is no truth, or unlike neo-Marxism, where truth is simply related to who you are in terms of the pecking order. It deals with the whole person and should not be narrow or utilitarian. I get into arguments here because I actually argue education is not utilitarian. It's more about cultivating a certain sense of the conversation, as Oakeshott would call it. And the disciplines evolve over time. And to pick up on some of the discussion this morning, it does deal with particular morals or values like reciprocity, mutual obligation, a commitment to the common good. In education for a long time, we only talked about our rights, and there was very little discussion about our responsibilities. And I think it's very important that we get back to a sense of mutual obligation, reciprocity, and those other factors. I was going to finish with Plato's parable of the cave, which many of you would know. But just very quickly, the idea is you've got slaves chained in an underground cave, a chamber. There's lighting, there's movement, there are shadows. For them, that is reality. They can't move their heads. And what happens in education, I'd argue, is that you unshackle these people. You allow them out of the cave. You allow them up the roadway, past the fire, past the various moving shadows, until they go outside, and they might be blinded initially by the sun. But education really gets you to look at what is a more transcendent sense of truth and reality. I mean, it has its practical, obviously, practical things are important, but to me, education isn't simply about making a living. It's also about that transcendent sense of having a higher moral and spiritual purpose, which actually is mentioned in the Melbourne Declaration, which is our roadmap for curriculum in Australia, where it does talk about moral and spiritual. But then the question becomes, well, how is that enacted in the classroom, and who should have responsibility for doing it? So thank you.